Okay, great. Welcome. My name is Tabrez Ibrahim, and I'm the moderator for this panel. I'm on the faculty at California Western School of Law, and the panel is titled Commerce and Economics in Islamic Social Contexts, Past, Present, and Future. And this panel will discuss the ways in which commerce and economics have been framed and viewed in disparate Islamic social context. I'm going to introduce the panel members each briefly. There are 5 panel members. They'll spend about 12 minutes for each of the 5 members. And then I will wrap up and have some time for Q&A from the audience members. So let me just go through the panel members and they'll introduce themselves in this order. First, we have Maya Schatz-Miller, who's on the faculty at Western University Department of History. Second is Nick Foster, who's formerly of the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Then Mehmet Asute, who's with the Durham Center for Islamic Economics and Finance at Durham University. Then Kristen Stilt, who's with Harvard University School of Law. And ABILA Hassan, who's with University of Nebraska Department of Modern Languages and Literature. I again am Tabrez Ibrahim. I focus on the intersection of Islamic law and intellectual property with a focus on patent law. I'm not going to be speaking, but I will turn it over in my moderating duties to Maya Schatz-Miller next. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Tabrez. Sorry, thank you, Tabrez. I get to confuse you anytime I get a chance. I'm a professor of history, basically. I teach history of the Middle East, Islamic societies, and so on. But my research is focused on social and economic history of medieval Islamic societies and the Middle East. I have published several works already on the subject I'm going to talk about. Some of it is mentioned, some of it it's not. I'm not going to waste more of my precious minutes on introducing myself, but I'm going to go right forward to my presentation. And of course, if there are questions, I'll be happy to refer to. All right, share screen. Okay. Open up. Okay, so my talk really revolves around the period of formation of Islamic law, which I try to bring back into history and especially into economic history. My basic concept is that Islamic law was formed in a specific historical background, which is a structural change in the economics of the Middle East. I would like to very briefly present you with what I intend to do, which is to pick 2 issues from women's property rights. One of them is the power to control birth control, to affect birth control. And the second one is to keep wage earnings. I believe that these 2 cases will allow me to provide a better and more efficient view of the relationship between Islamic law formation and the economic background in the Middle East. Eventually, I try to take it forward into the performance of the economy of the Middle East. I will not hide it from you that I have a basic disagreement with some recent literature produced by economic historians. Timur Kuran is one sample, the other one is Eric Cheney, who are saying that Islamic law and Islamic institutions in general are the cause for modern backwardness in the Middle East. So I cleared out this issue, and I believe I have the good tools to challenge it. I develop a new quantitative database in order to argue my case for women. Obviously, the case of women is directly relevant to conditions, current conditions in the Middle East. I conclude by making the claim that the historical formation of women-friendly institutions, as I will demonstrate, is only a part of a more general trend of legal institutions that have to do with social, economic, and legal norms that have been formed in the Middle East. I published an earlier version of the discussion here in the Scottish Journal of Political Economy special issue. The evidence. What is the evidence that I'm using? I'm using the literary sources, not so much historical, which I do as well, but mostly the law, the furu, and the legal records of the court decision, fatwas, and legal documents, and so on. My statistics, which I will show in a minute, is to be found in a database on my university website that has various databases, including the one called Equity and Inequality, which has all the databases relevant to this particular presentation. So here is a summary that I have compiled myself of women's property rights in Islamic law. I have covered all four legal schools, but in terms of the court records, my main source are the Maliki school, mostly North Africa and Muslim Spain. I have covered here all the various rights, including when it is that they can be inquired, what are the conditions, what are the requirements, and the various legal manipulations that may affect them. Most importantly, the most fundamental condition is marriage at a certain point in terms of income, I'm talking, not in terms of rights, but in terms of the capacity to generate income and to keep income. So as you can see, I highlighted here the right to earn wages and the right to agree to birth control, which are going to be the two cases that I want to focus on. So what are the highlights that I take from the general view, or the general rights, I would say, the picture as a whole of women property rights? First of all, I would say not quite equality, but very similar in the sense that women have exactly the same rights as male to work, to keep wages, to receive wages, which are very important. It doesn't mean that they have exactly equity equality, namely that men can generate more income during their lifetime than women. Having said that, there is a complete separation of property between husband and wife during the marriage. And this is the condition that remains valid for the duration of the marriage and until death. Namely, a man cannot come to his wife and say, I want your money, I want to control your money, and so on. I have plenty of fatwas that demonstrate that this was indeed in force. Women can acquire property and dispose property at will. Real estate, property, and so on is transferred to them during the marriage negotiations, and they actually acquire it in the marriage contract. As a result of it, marriage contracts, both in Islamic documents and in the Geniza document, which are contemporary, register all the property that women receive during the moment of marriage. And this is why this is the most common document that we have in the medieval period in terms of the rights of males and women, the marriage contract. Women have the right to be employed and receive wages. This is extremely important and extremely useful, as I'm going to say. The structural change that occurred in the economy made it possible for them to acquire money. Income earned remained under their control for the duration of their lives. Then women have the right, what I call rights over the body, namely in various, as Bassem Musallam has, I think, demonstrated, and somehow this literature has been ignored in historical terms. All schools allow it, all schools enforce it. Women have the right to sanction birth control by their husband. They also have the right, in some schools, to be paid for agreeing to this particular right. Theory, the economic theory which I use is really nothing unique or particular. I use especially two kinds of theory. One about property rights, which is Douglas North I use preferably. There are other theory on that. And with regard to women wages and demographics, I use Galore unified growth theory. Douglas North is relevant to us because of what he advanced many years ago. He says communities that live in communal property rights would not be interested in limiting the numbers, in limiting the fertility rate, because there is nothing to really risk. The more you have, the more property you would get. These things are changing when the community is moving into a property regime. What we see typical, birth control appears, namely the desire to limit the numbers. That has immediate significance for fertility rate in the Middle East and so on. Pre-Islamic Arabian tribes lived in a communal regime. There were no property rights. Herds were kept in communal, whatever tents, whatever we have elsewhere. The change occurred when they moved into the Middle East. The thing that is important here is that birth control was actually supported by men, and I'm going to go back to it when the moment comes. What is important in terms of theory as well, that women were able to get into labor markets and to earn wages. That has to do with a major structural change that in theory is linked to empowerment of women, and eventually both things lead to what we call better children, not as many children, but better quality children. Mostly the idea is entry into gaining more human capital, giving the children more chances to proceed. Okay, so here's my model. I combine economic change with the legal change. I talk about women's employment leading to women's property rights, and I combine the two, high per capita income as a result of women's property. And I will try to demonstrate it also quantitatively. Okay. The structural changes in the economy, I cannot go into details. Obviously, it involves a very long lecture on what exactly happened. What happened is that the Middle East goes through a major demographic shift in the sense that we had the Justinian plague. The fact that there isn't as much research on the Justinian plague doesn't mean that there were no major impact. We have, for 3 centuries, recurrence of the plague. Population levels are low. What happens in the Middle East is something very unique. We have high urbanization rate. We all know about Baghdad, but that's a general phenomenon that occurs. The Arabs do not move into the countryside. They come into the Middle East, they move into the cities. That has a major effect. We have economic development within the cities that creates high wages. High wages enable consumption and enable higher demand for luxury consumer goods. This is going to be a factor in enabling women to get into labor market and to earn wages therefore the need to secure wages in their hands. Now I want to present some of my quantitative data. My interest in doing this is actually to substantiate my claim that women had a bigger share of income and a bigger share of GDP, if you want, in urban societies, but because I believe there was a vertical integration between the primary and the secondary sector, women in the countryside were affected by this as well. So I collected data, first of all, to begin with the presents that women get as they get married. I have averages, you can see I have very nice numbers of observations. Obviously in medieval Islam, the problem is the observation. So what I call the bride price. I don't call it dowry, I call it bride price. The family gift, here we have another quantitative measure and divided into the presents that our wealthy women are getting and the presents that our women from not such favorite background are getting. Wages are a problem because as in Europe, right? As in Europe, in the historical documents, you don't have women's wages. European economic historians have approached this problem by using male wages and assuming that women's wages will shift between 50% of male wages and 66%. What you see here, male wages, are numbers that I have elaborated with a colleague of mine, Professor Pamuk from Istanbul, about the wage numbers that we can have for males, right? This is based on various data in the period after the plague and how it affected. I calculated 50%, 66% in order to get more or less orders of magnitude for women's wages. And here is my final argument on this issue, which has to say, I put together everything. Inheritance is indeed a problem because it varies so much and you don't have really numbers for it. Based on the practice in Europe, for example, and also in the Jewish community in Cairo, Geniza, the inheritance, which Jewish women do not get, is assumed to be the share of the inheritance that you get, namely that the presents that a woman gets when the moment she marries can be calculated in terms as replacing the inheritance. Altogether, what we have is, I calculated here, various versions, 50%, 66% with inheritance, without inheritance, where I put a value of women's worth. My argument is women's lifetime worth was considerable enough to present a new reality, which is two earners household, namely household that can be supported by extra income from the wife, even though according to Islamic law, wives are not obligated to contribute to the household maintenance. This is the role of men. But nonetheless, the fact that we have women with their own property, with their own income, is reflected in various court documents. I have a very interesting court document from Granada in Spain, where a woman lends her husband money to give their daughter a bride price. Okay.
We may need to wrap up here because just to remain,
yes.
Last thought, I guess you have for summarizing, because I think just to leave time for everything.
Yes, exactly. So I will summarize it the following. These are the various wage labor connections in the economy. And this is my final slide, where I basically claim that we are dealing here with socio-legal economic norms developing in the Middle East, And the fact that Islamic law, being a product of urban elites, we can look into it as a reflection of a combination of various factors in the Islamic city or the Islamic neighborhood, both social and economic. The final claim that I want to make is that indeed Islamic legal institutions, and especially as they are expressed in a women-friendly institution, shows that Islamic institutions and legal institutions were indeed efficient, and as a result can be associated with economic growth and not with economic development retardation, as is assumed by some economic historians.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. All right. So we will go next to Nick Foster. And reminder, we'll do about 12 minutes per person. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tabriz. Just share my screen for me. So share the screen. Here we go. All right. So hope you can see that. It's over here. I should say, first of all, that unlike some colleagues, I'm a comparative lawyer. I don't lay claim to the depth and breadth of knowledge that, for example, Maya has displayed. But I really am looking at this from the point of view of a lawyer. I used to be a practicing lawyer way back when in another existence, and have come to think about certain things in terms of comparison, and particularly that's led me to legal history, which is where I've got to with this presentation. So what I'm going to talk about today, go back to that for a moment, is commercial law in the Islamic world, past, the transitions, present and future, and I've tried to reflect the title of the panel in that title. Firstly, why is commerce and why is commercial law important in what we're talking about, Islamic social contexts? They're fairly easy questions to answer. Commerce obviously has an essential role in any society, and in Islamic societies in particular. And in the interaction between Islamic and other societies, that's perhaps a less obvious point, because people trade between different societies. And it has led to social, including legal changes in Islamic societies. Commercial law has an essential role, again, an obvious point in facilitating commerce, but less obviously perhaps again in some Islamic societies, spearheading not just commercial law change, but also legal systemic change, the changes in legal systems. And that's a point which is often ignored in the literature, or underestimated, well, say really ignored in the literature on legal systemic change. What do we mean by commercial law? That's a surprisingly complex and controversial issue. Many people think that their definition of commercial law, the definition of commercial law they learn in law school and they use in their legal system, is the definition of commercial law. That's not true. There are many different definitions of commercial law. In the Shari'a, there's no formal category as such. There is a de facto distinction. Contrast France and England and Wales. France has droit commercial. I use the French term because it's not English commercial law. It's distinguished by law from civil law, droit civil, with separate codes. And the law of société, or companies and partnerships, is a very important part of that law. Whereas in England and Wales, there's no formal distinction at all. In the technical meaning of the term, commercial law is the law of commercial transactions, not that of companies and partnerships. In the general meaning, it means law of all relating to all commercial matters. But note that they're very different things, French droit commercial and English commercial law. Russia is a jurisdiction, a source of law in a considerable part of the Islamic world, which again is neglected often, but very important, and has, as I understand it, no formal category. We also need to consider some international aspects. the old lex mercatoria, often called the medieval lex mercatoria, which was basically customary mercantile norms intertwined with local law in quite a complex way. The new lex mercatoria, which some colleagues may well recognize, which the very existence of which is quite controversial, but let's assume it exists, a set of norms which is enforced in arbitral tribunals, and the law of international trade, harmonized norms such as Incoterms, free on board, CIF, so on and so forth, sets of rules like the rules that relate to letters of credit. In this presentation, I'm using the term commercial law to cover all of those meanings, but not some other more general things like dispute resolution in commercial matters, or recent international legal orders, such as international investment law and so on and so forth. So it's a fairly narrow traditional meaning of commercial law. The past, Islamic commercial law. There's no such thing as, there's such category in Islamic law as a category of commercial law like in English law or French law, but let's use that term, it's pretty justifiable. Why? What's the context of Islamic commercial law? I've got a quote here. The Arabs succeeded in developing long-distance trade on a scale which surpassed anything known before, a huge area with very few restrictions on trade. Commerce was religiously and socially acceptable. We always say that the Prophet was a merchant. Always point out that the Prophet was a merchant before his prophetic mission and took a favorable view on his trade. And many prominent figures in Islam were merchants, such as Abu Hanifa, with the eponym of the Hanafi madhab. There's one representation of Islamic trade routes. There are many, but you can see just how great an area was covered by those trade routes. All those factors encouraged the development of Islamic commercial law. There's not much evidence available as to its efficacy, but it seems to have been an efficient system. And something I should stress here is that it was also a relatively harmonious system with variations across the schools, but it seems that there was nothing really which we can think of as equivalent to our international aspects of commercial law, which I referred to in one of the previous slides. Also, the Islamic commercial may well have influenced the development of European commercial law. Words such as aval may well come from Arabic hawala. Average comes from the use of the word average and the concept of average in maritime law. That definitely is a word which comes from Arabic, as is Czech, ultimately from Persian, from Farsi rather, muhatra, a pure Arabic word, and the idea of the commenda, the investment partnership, which may well have been influenced by the Islamic mudaraba. The transitions. This is a very complex and varied set of transitions, actually. I put transition brackets, S, close brackets. One transition made up of many, difficult to say whether there's one or more. It's overall a very clear, a very big process with lots and lots of variations. And as I said, beware of generalizations. An under-researched field, often severely so. In this analysis, I'm only talking about formal law, not other legal or quasi-legal orders. There are quite a few of those, so quite a few caveats to make here. The transition came out of European domination. Commerce is an important factor, as I've said before, in social, political, and legal systemic change. The commercial law transformation spearheaded the legal systemic change in important polities, such as the Ottoman Empire and Egypt. And what happened was, in some places, that European-derived law replaced Islamic commercial law, or it survived in European-based legal systems and was subordinated to those legal systems in the new regime, the new political regime of the nation state, supplemented by European-derived specialist commercial law. And somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, there was no significant resistance to that transition. In the transitions, one can draw a broad contrast, firstly, between law which was imposed in the context of direct imperial control, and law which was transplanted as a result of influence in territories not subject to direct imperial control. You can draw another contrast between modern law being mainly made up of, or mainly or entirely made up of Western-derived law, or mixed to some degree with Islamic commercial law, in a rather different form, in a statutory form often, or sometimes in its original form. Sometimes there's a relationship between those two contrasting processes, and sometimes there isn't. Putting a little bit of flesh on those bones, there's a little table which can give you an idea of the complexity and the variety of the processes, running through very, very quickly. Some of the French sub-Saharan African, most of the French sub-Saharan African territories, obviously they got their law from France, and ABILA, the organization for the harmonization of business law in Africa, which is essentially a French-based law process. Guinea-Bissau, Comoros, Djibouti, you can see all that. The Arab Middle East has various models which influence the states of the Gulf, and all sorts of different processes you can see in that table. Tunisia, Morocco, and Mauritania, the Santillana Code, a mix of Western-derived law and French law, Islamic law, beg your pardon. Saudi Arabia, rather special case, with Shari'a as the base plus some Western-derived law, and presently under major revision. Iran, another special case. Turkey, which has a new regime based on Swiss law and German law. I won't even go near Libya, Israel, West Bank, the Gaza and Albania, and Afghanistan, because they're all very complex, and so on and so forth. What's the result? What's the present? Well, we have a fragmented regime, as you can see from the table. Compare that to the relatively harmonious Islamic commercial law, national legal systems, different types. And it's in what I call the modern global legal architecture of nation states, each with their law and with international normative orders to remedy some of the deficiencies. Got a little over 1 minute left by my clock, so I'll move on to some transplant problems. Colleagues will no doubt be well aware of problems of transplanting legal systems and legal law into unfamiliar environments. There are several problems. One is just sheer incompetence. That can be seen in the Ottoman experience, when they just didn't know what they were doing and had to deal with the consequences. Legal systemic deficiencies, including dependence on past colonial powers, such as a disconnect, and by contrast, a disconnect with the donor systems in other areas, and a disconnect with Islamic religious principles and legal history. So even if Islamic commercial law is still there, it can be cut off from its roots. We also have, interestingly, a partial revival. These are my terms: Sharia-influenced regimes such as the UAE, which has a Sharia-based civil code, Sharia-based regime in Saudi Arabia, different regime in Iran. And that's my time up. An accommodation, interestingly, of international needs, that you have common law regimes which have been put into place to deal with international financiers, international commercial organizations who don't want to have Sharia influence or Sharia-based regimes governing their transactions. So the Abu Dhabi Global Market, DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Center, and so on and so forth, with English common law influence in the Gulf and generally. And interestingly, just right now, very, very recently, languages other than Arabic being allowed in Bahraini courts. State of academic research, I know I've gone over a little time, but bear with me if you may for this. This is very near the end. Sadly, it's this field is rather a poor relation of Islamic law studies and Islamic studies generally. I find it's certainly the way what I look at, for good reasons and some bad reasons. It requires an awful lot of knowledge of an awful lot of areas. There's a huge range of regions. There are very few of us dealing with it. Patchy regional coverage, patchy subject coverage. Some of it's really not very good. But there is some hope of improvement, especially in places like INSAF but also some possible pressures on that scholarship because of the requirements of Islamic finance itself. What's the future? Watch this space, I think is all I can say, really. We've been surprised in the past few years by things like the emergence of the DIFC and EIFC law, its spread, its general acceptance in other areas, and by the Astana International Financial Center and things like that, which hark back to the capitulations, the much maligned capitulations, and suddenly rather similar things to the capitulations pop up. And if anybody's interested, I have some interesting reflections. So I've got to stop there.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Any comments gratefully received.
All right, thank you very much. Just to make sure we have time for everybody, Mehmet is next. We'll have to do a hard stop at 12 minutes so as to leave time for everybody. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I need to screen. Nick, I don't know whether you have stopped your screen sharing. Somehow it doesn't allow me.
Come back to. Oh,
okay, sorry. Okay.
You're okay now.
Not yet. Still, we can see yours. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Big button.
Okay. I guess I'm on screen now. Okay. Thank you very much, Tabriz. I'm happy to be here with colleagues and enjoying so far. Mine mainly looking at the contemporary Islamic finance and looking at the challenge between instrumentalized morality and the substantive morality, looking at the emergence and what we have ended up with under the market conditions. But in order to develop a sense, what is the role that we have for finance? Of course, finance has become the main source of wealth creation, unfortunately. I use the word unfortunately. However, in terms of the real meaning of finance, it is expected to be an intermediary only. And therefore, initially financing, but of course, in the very contemporary times that we have now, is entirely financialization, finance creating wealth. And hence this embedded nature, not necessarily being embedded in the real economy. However, as the quotation here by Schiller, as well as by many others, finance is expected to work within the goals of a particular society, whatever the goals of that society, and hence an alignment between the goals of the society and how finance can aim at contributing to that process. And therefore, it should not be, it has to be related to a means towards a productive life. But when we look at, and therefore this beautiful photograph I got from one financial institution in Brazil when I was talking, it is the objective. What's the objective? The art of protecting and financing people. And that's very much the Islamic, the whole Islamic morality, which aims at. And however, when we look at the reality in the contemporary world, financialization in itself, it does not have anything to do with the social goals or the goals of the society. And the world GDP is only a very small fraction of the financial assets that we have in the world, and hence huge disembeddedness, which creates, of course, all those crises that we have around us. And therefore, the emergence of Islamic moral economy, what I call, perhaps this picture can help us to understand that, to establish that equity society, not only equality, but moving into, in other words, bringing substantive morality and aiming to establish a particular society in which Ihsani society, what I call the Ihsani society, in other words, beneficence, the socialized individual aiming at establishing equilibrium in the society through equity as it is in the middle. However, Islamic moral economy aims at even going beyond that to overcome the barriers in accessing to resources, because the whole idea that resources are created by Allah and therefore they should not be commodified, and therefore people should have access to those, establishing justice and equity, therefore the importance, even to that extent, entirely removing barriers. And that is very much located in the Islamic moral economy's conceptualization of what economy should be, emancipating and empowering, emancipating individual and empowering individual and society in the process, in this emergence. And therefore, however, when we look at the 1950s, the post-colonial responses, very much the Weberian responding to the Weberian argument, but ending up with the Rodinson's subaltern imagination of capitalism and Islamic finance moving towards that direction. However, the emergence is very much in the Polanyian sense is the rescuing process, rescuing human, rescuing land, labor, environment, and etc. from the domination, and therefore the whole prohibition of interest. And the objective, therefore, is identified as the Islamic society, establishing equity in the society, emancipating. And this term that is very much used in Indonesia is Rahmatul Alamin. When they define Islamic economics, it's a Rahmatul Alamin. It's a blessing to humanity and the world in that sense. And therefore, in this imagination, the whole idea of establishing justice, when justice is not enough, therefore the whole idea of equity, establishing equity through ihsan, because the conceptualization is based on Allah created the world in an order, in a balanced order, and therefore ihsan aims at bringing always back to that order. And so when there's a deviation, therefore the whole Islah or the reform process always bringing back to that order or the balance in the society through ihsan. And therefore here what we have is a substantive morality. It is just beyond fiqh or the codified Islamic law, because it's very much in the contemporary practice, at least, it is very much divorced from the morality. It is very much rational. And hence Islamic economics imagination or defining human in a particular way, which is different than the economics that we have around us, as a individual objective function is very much related with falah, in other words, salvation in this world and in the hereafter, and how that can be achieved by socializing through ihsan. How much a person can do for the betterment of the society, so that the mizan or the balance order or the equilibrium can be sustained in the society, and the emancipation and empowerment can be achieved, such as emancipation from domination and therefore accessibility to resources, even domination from capital, debtness discouraged heavily within the Islamic moral economy. So the idea is sustaining that mizan. The creation is very much that balance order, and within that the interaction between different stakeholders has to follow that that balance. And therefore, whatever the departure you have, it causes problems such as poverty, denial of accessibility to resources, environmental crisis, denial of the opportunity space for the environment to develop, the social crisis, economic crisis, and etc. Human rights problems. They are all because of the disruption of this mizan. And therefore, ihsan as a source of perfection is a movement towards establishing or sustaining that order that we have around us. Because in this Islamic moral economic conceptualization, as opposed to the economics understanding through the Enlightenment philosophy that everything that you have around you is a right, instead, everything that you have around you is a privilege. And therefore, it is a stakeholding understanding of a moral economy. And it benefits from the definitions. When we look at the definitions of Islamic economics, therefore, which have been developed through the post-colonial period, very much either establishing justice or overcoming justice, and understanding that individual objective function is very much falah-oriented, salvation-oriented, and in achieving that, the importance of ihsan, socializing for others so that the sustainability of the order can be achieved. And that is very much expressed in the word iqtisad rather than the economics. Therefore, very much critical that in the construction of Islamic economics as a modern science, they opted for economics as a term because it comes with a particular package, rational individual, maximizing individuals' utilitarian understanding. However, when we look at the iqtisad as an Arabic word, the source is qasd and qist, two terms, and qasd directly relates to directing towards an objective, the true path in line with an aim. Qist, however, is the just share and justice. And therefore, looking at all these definitions, what we end up with emancipation and empowerment, stakeholding-centered development, embeddedness in the social formation of society, an individual seeking for falah or the salvation through expanding the equilibrium in the society through ihsan. And therefore, iqtisad directly relates to maintaining the sustainability. And within that, of course, when we look at the axiomatic world in constituting this worldview, tawhid, or the complementarity and unitarity in the knowledge that directly tells us that all the stakeholders and their interests are complementing each other. And therefore, there has to be that balance between the interests of all the stakeholders, because the objective is to establish ABILA or justice through ihsan. And in recognizing that, yes, everything and everyone has to grow, but that growth should not be at the expense of others, as Tazkiyah tells us. In the same way, Rububiyyah tells us that Allah created everything and everyone around us with an opportunity space to develop, with a development path. And that has to be facilitated. And everything that we have around us is an amana, is a trust, and therefore their rights, their interest has to be sought for in the process. And maqasid al-Shari'a is a methodology to use for such an objective. And maqasid al-Shari'a, as we know, is the objective of Sharia, which means, which is interpreted as essentializing the interests of all the stakeholders in whatever we are doing. So within this understanding, riba, prohibition of interest, is very much related to establishing that order again between different stakeholders by negating the domination of capital, bringing to the same level with the other stakeholders in a very much substantive morality understanding, rather than the instrumentalized understanding of morality as we see in the application of fiqh in Islamic banking. In the same way, zakat as well is the right of the society to be returned to society, because with the privatized realm of production, individuals are excluded from all the resources created by Allah, and therefore their compensation, the compensation for their inaccessibility through zakat has to be provided. Again, as we can see, both of them relate to expropriation. One is the capital domination create expropriation. The other, of course, zakat, because of the resources available around us. And within that understanding, of course, in order to have an organic emergence, we would we would expect.
Sorry? We may need to get to the summary slide in the next 30 seconds.
Okay, so therefore, when we look at the whole emergence, unfortunately, the institutions have to emerge within the value system of Islam in order to have an impact. But when we look at the Islamic finance, of course, I'm just quickly moving, and we would expect finance within this understanding to be embedded into the value system. It has to be sharing and cooperative and collaborative, risk sharing and profit loss sharing type of qualities, extended stakeholding. However, when we look at the practice, of course, unfortunately, the Islamic finance, the way it is operating, unfortunately, those qualities are not reflected in the contemporary application. And it is because of the grafting process under the market conditions. Unfortunately, it's only relegated to fiqh or the form. So by looking at the form, but missing the substance in the process, I will be finishing in a bit. But looking at the entire issue is
sorry to wrap up here, but
just with this one, I will finish. Hopefully, if I can get. So what we have in the Islamic finance today, somehow it's not moving. I think it doesn't want me to show this slide.
Maybe just to wrap up.
Okay, just to wrap up. I mean, what I want to say is that under the market conditions, unfortunately, Islamic finance operations have been shifted from the expected morality into unfortunately market conditions and entirely essentializing market conditions. And therefore, this morality that we would expect, rather than just the negative screening areas, what is prohibited, but what is expected from the moral conditions are not happening in the current practice. Therefore, as a solution, as a feature, what can be done now, it is this fiqhi and form screening, prohibitions or intention has to be substantiated with directly with the substance-oriented screening in order to achieve the Islamic morality in its essence. So rather than just fiqh, but the substance has to be bring
Just for the
to the
sake of
equation.
time,
Thank you very
we may-
much.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just because of the shared screening, we'll go to Kristen Stilt next. and
Immediate
then-
stopping.
Yep. And we won't have time for Q&A, unfortunately, but I'm sure the panelists would be available by email. I certainly have some questions. So we may have to do about, I think we want to just be very sharp with the timing here. And I think we'll end right at the time here. And I'll share some time updates to those remaining. Thank you very much.
ABILA doesn't lose her time completely. I'm just going to try to move this out of the way. And here we go. Okay, here we go. All right, let me try to do this as quickly as possible. Thank you very much for organizing this. I have a provocative title here. It's not intended to suggest that the halal industry is the source of global destruction, but it's intended to be very provocative and to ask ourselves what is happening in our world today with climate change, with the overwhelming scientific consensus, rising sea levels, mass extinctions, extreme weather, food security, and threats and harms to human health. This is not all on the halal industry in meat and animal products, but we have to ask, where is halal, where are the halal voices in these urgent matters that we have today? So what is halal? It really just means permissible. It is a Quranic term, and you can see that we have a Quranic verse right here. Tayyibin, we won't have time to talk about that, but it is definitely a Quranic concept, permissibility, and tied to consumption. But today, the situation is far more complex than a Quranic verse. There are many, many producers of halal. There are many labels, and this raises one point to make clear. As you can see from all of these diverse labels from different jurisdictions, there is no one halal in the world today. There's no one international standard. There's no one body. How do we go from a Quranic verse to this? I want to give a very brief history and draw out some implications. Well, they involve two big players, Iran and Saudi Arabia. The buying and selling of meat was taking place from what we might call non-Muslim producers to Muslim producers for decades, without anyone really paying attention to something called halal certification. It was just understood to be halal. That changed in the late 1970s due to events in Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I'll just focus on Iran in order to be brief. Ayatollah Khomeini made a speech in which he said, these foreign carcasses are unacceptable. Our people have to eat foreign carcasses, meat which is bad and rotten and which are forbidden by the religion to eat. He's criticizing in part the Shah's reliance on foreign food. So what happens? Iran sends delegations to their biggest supplier, New Zealand, to try to figure out, is the meat they're producing acceptable? Because at the time of the revolution, Iranians were consuming far more meat than they were producing domestically. So the international suppliers were crucial. So Iranian butchers and religious scholars go to New Zealand to assess the situation. What were they looking for when they went there? What would deem the meat acceptable? Well, there's some pretty straightforward, generally accepted rules for the production of halal meat, leaving aside that the animal has to be permissible. So no pigs. A sharp instrument is used to cut these parts of the neck, generally in a single cut. The animal must die to blood loss due to the cut. The slaughterer should be a Muslim or maybe a Christian or a Jew, and the name of God should be invoked. So the Iranians said, yeah, it looks pretty good, you're doing the right thing. But eventually it became not practical for Iranians to sit in the New Zealand and then Australian slaughterhouses. So the certification idea developed that New Zealand entities and Australian entities would do the work of the Iranians and the Saudis, and they would be the ones saying, we're the ones telling you that these are indeed halal, thus leading to this proliferation. So the origins of halal are in international trade. And then once these certifiers emerged, they started certifying domestic production as well. And thus this massive world of certification for export purposes and for domestic use purposes. Now, the animals they kill and the meat they produce were the prompt. So it's international and it's about meat. And we believe that about 20% of the global trade in animal products are halal. And it's an $8 trillion trade. So this is a very significant amount of animals we're talking about. Just to give you some quick numbers, this is overall, not just for halal purposes, but overall, of course, pigs will never be halal, but I wanted you to see the numbers. Sheep, goats, cattle, seafood, huge amounts of seafood. And the numbers are increasing. They are not decreasing. And in countries that are with a rising middle class, the consumption of meat is even going higher and higher. Okay, so where does this take us? Where am I going? Well, don't walk away thinking this is what it looks like for a cow to be raised in the United States or really anywhere else. It looks like this, cattle feedlots, and it looks like this. This is a manure lake next to a cattle feedlot. All right, so let's go back to the basic rules. As you can notice, nowhere in these rules are we talking about the contribution of the animals to climate change, to methane produced in the atmosphere, to animal welfare. These rules, which I believe were produced to facilitate trade, not block trade, were made as simple as possible. And a whole lot of things were not included or not considered in these early days of determination of halal. So let me just show you something quickly from a US certifier, Ivanka. Their language in their magazine about what animals deserve is quite stark. It seems that livestock animals are held in less esteem, since most of the time we see them not as living, breathing creatures, but as butchered pieces, packaged for sale or hung up as hunting trophies. In Islam, we are taught that all animals, livestock, birds, pets, and wilds must be treated kindly and respectfully. Even the animals we slaughter have rights. Now that sentiment, however, appears nowhere in the halal rules promulgated by Ivanka or really any other certifying organization. Okay, so we have the question of animal welfare not being taken into account. And we also have the question of, as I alluded to before, of greenhouse gas emissions, which the production of animals does generate in significant numbers. And if we had time, we could talk about why methane is so important. It's more potent than carbon dioxide, but it also dissipates more quickly. So animal agriculture, I think, is a really key to our climate change problem. All right, so let me end up here by saying the halal system is so dominant today that we are really left in a world where these other considerations of animal welfare, of climate change, of even the volume of animals produced are not part of the equation. And so you may say, well, why blame halal? You know, this is the same with any conventional meat production. And of course it is. But the point I want to make is that what are our wedges into these industries that are so damaging to our planet? The wedge in into the halal industry is a little more difficult because there's so much built up around the symbol and consumers feeling security that the symbol tells us the product is not only permissible, but it's good and it's safe. And the last thing I'll say is, in part of my research, I intend to do some consumer surveys to see what do consumers think they're getting when they get a halal product. Do they think it's good for the animal? Do they think it's good for the environment? Like, what are the perceptions? And so that's why I have a question mark. What is halal's contribution? Not to the problem only, but to the solution of solving the climate change and other significant problems that we face today. And I hope I've ended in 12 minutes. And thank you to Brez for organizing the panel.
Oh, thank you very much. Fascinating, great topic. And we've got enough time here. And then I think we'll have a minute for wrapping up. So ABILA, you're next. And thank you very much as well.
Okay, I have to stop before she can get in, right?
Oh, sure.
Yes.
And,
Okay.
and for those attending, we may have ability to email the panelists for questions later.
Please do. Please email me.
Abla, hope you're able to.
Yes, I'm just.
Okay.
Yes. So thank you so much for having me. I'm Abla Hassan, Associate Professor of Practice of Arabic Language and Culture at Nebraska University and the coordinator of the Arabic Studies program. To save time, I'm not going to be sharing slides, but I'm so excited to share some of my research with you beyond economic necessity, an argument against hardship as a condition for Muslim women participation in the workforce. Today, I argue against economic necessity as a condition, let alone as the condition for women work. Some of this research came originally in my book, Decoding the Egalitarianism of the Quran, originally published in 2019 and coming in paperback November 15. Let me start by a very quick introduction. While the participation of Muslim women in the workforce has increased in all modern nations, arguments from economic necessity as a justification, a reason, and even as a condition and a prerequisite for women's participation are still brought out of the closet from time to time in the Muslim world to question the authenticity of this modern switch in the workforce. For many, the full acknowledgement of women's agency, political, religious, and economic, is a result of pressure from modernity, globalization, and Western adopted policies. Many Muslim women, unfortunately, are still harassed with reminders of their most sacred biological role as mothers and the need to prioritize their so-called God-given rules to anything and everything. They're commonly encouraged to dismiss any career development opportunity unless driven by an economic necessity. All Islamic traditionalists, and some even among moderate Muslims, continue to insist that the Arabic Renaissance, which can only flourish if it's essentially religious, requires that women return to their so-called God-given rules. According to many, women's work can be tolerated only in case of necessity, which is typically understood to be economic circumstances. In this presentation, I argue for the right to work as a gender-neutral and conditional Islamic right par excellence. And I explain the fallacious nature and self-contradictory nature of the argument for economic necessity as a condition for women's right to work. My strategy to negate economic necessity as an Islamic argument stems from highlighting contradictions between this argument and other well-established arguments advocated by the very same imams and clergy. Now, whether one agrees with these arguments or not is a different topic and goes beyond what I'm aiming at achieving today. What needs to be stressed, though, is the resulting logical inconsistency within the argument for men's open right to work and women's conditional right to work. There are so many fatwas. To give just one example from a very well-known, prominent Muslim scholar, Shari'a, who died in 1998, he claims, and I'm going to be quoting, in his interpretation of 3333, that women who repeatedly leave their homes have no use inside their homes. This he contrasts with good housewives who have no time to go out. So what is so wrong with economic necessity as a condition for women's participation in the workforce? First, the argument for domestic labor as the ideal status for Muslim women who should not aspire to careers unless driven to that by economic necessity nullifies the argument for hijab, which is still a dominant agreed upon stance. If one goal of modesty is equality in the public sphere, prevention of sex objectification, and minimizing the abuse of communication in the workplace, the question will be, what would be the need to consider hijab in societies where women don't join men in the public sphere in the first place? Second, this argument contradicts what we read in the Quran, supposed to work as the first resource of legislation. In the Quranic story of Moses, he meets two women, commonly believed to be the daughters of the prophet Shu'aib or the biblical Jethro. According to this story, the two women were watering their animals among the shepherds when Moses first saw them. They explained to Moses that they're doing that difficult work because their father was an old man. Moses offered his help and they invited him to meet their father, who eventually suggested that Moses, as a reward for his help, could marry one of his daughters. The story is typically used by critics of women working as evidence for its prohibition. These critics base their view on the prophet's reaction and his immediate offer to help, the premise being that he was alarmed to see two women working. In fact, I suggest that the story can be interpreted quite the opposite way. One of the two women suggested hiring Moses. This indicates that they could afford to hire someone to help. And I'm quoting here 28-26 from the Quran. One of the women said, "Father, hire him. A strong, trustworthy man is the best to hire." Although the arrangement was made for one of the daughters to marry Moses for his labor, this doesn't negate the fact that according to the Quranic story, at least, the initial offer, as the daughter proposed, was to hire Moses and not have her father propose a marriage between them. Third, this argument contradicts the Islamic concept of work as a religious rewarded duty. Some scholars who insist on viewing women's work as a one-dimensional economic activity reveal that their understanding of work doesn't go beyond its superficial link to material values, which are not authentic values, Islamic values, or that their evaluation of the right to work is entirely sexist. It's a right exclusive to men. If work is one way to provide the community of believers the chance to become true deputies of God on earth, as the Quran clearly established as the reason for a human existence, as we read in 2030, why should women be excluded from participating in that mission? Fourth, this argument nullifies the Quranic endorsement of women's full humanity, asserted as an ontological fact from the beginning, from the moment of creation. Because if women are equal to men, and work is a way to fulfill God's assigned mission to humans on earth, excluding women from work means the degradation of their humanity, quite contrary to the Quran. In 4:1 we read, "O humanity, be mindful of you, Lord, who created you from a single soul, and from it he created its mate, and through both he spread countless men and women." I hope I'm on time. I'm ending only with a quote from the very famous Egyptian feminist Nawal al-Saadawi in her book Al-Untha Hiya al-Asl, The Female is the Origin, in which she draws attention to this misogynist attitude of women's work by saying, "The ultimate fear of the patriarchal society is when women prove their excellence in education, in scientific and in academic work environments. The reason for their panic is the belief that when women taste the happiness of mental fulfillment and its forbidden pleasure, they might become carried away in that direction. Then men will not find anyone to serve them in homes, to cook for them, and wash the children's clothing." Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just first thank all the panelists. I know this is a short time that we have and such fascinating topics. I know I've got questions. I will add Kristen Stilt's reception, I think, just went away. She apologized. She was sending me a message and saying that she's available via email if anybody has questions, and she apologizes for something dropping off technologically here. So we've got 4 minutes. I don't know if we have time other than maybe, I know there's attendees here that would have possibly questions. And let's do this. I just want to make sure panelists are available by email if attendees have. I think if we asked a question, it would be very challenging to get everything here in the short 3 minutes or less left. But maybe if there's just a parting thought very quickly, 30 seconds or so from any of the panelists, that may be good, or ways to reach you if you'd like. Anybody wants to jump in? I will say you can find me on my faculty website at California Western School of Law with my email address. And I'm happy to take questions on patents and Islamic law if anybody has. Let me do this. If there's any questions, let's say among the panelists or any comments, we've still got 2.5 minutes, and that may be good. I think it's a great panel, such fascinating topics here. Maybe what we can do, I see the chat windows available since we have people here. I'm going to put my email address if anybody wants to contact me. And, you know, if others want to do that, feel free. And I'm happy to chat. That may be just a quick way of, you know, sharing contact info to the extent people would like to do that. I'm certainly reachable by email. I wanted to apologize. Sorry for the shortness of it. It goes by so quickly because we're more used to these academic talks that are longer and such great exchange of information that comes in those sort of longer in-depth questions and answers. But fascinating indeed. And
Can I say thank you very, very, very much, Tabrez, and thank you to all colleagues. It's been great to meet you, great to see you, great to hear your presentations. And as I said in my own presentation, I'm very, very, very happy to answer any questions. I'm very happy for anybody to have any comments. It's all work in progress, and really great to have that.
Well, personally, I'm glad to connect with everybody here as well. And I'll add, I wanted to thank also the organizers with International Law Weekend, and they've been great in all the technological stuff, all the planning, all the promotion, and connecting everybody, and just well done as well. And I know there's attendees here that there are some other ones as well, and great to see participation. So since we've got like 30 seconds left, I thought I'd just wrap up here. Thank you again for the panelists. I really appreciate it. It's great to speak, hear everyone's talk, and just fascinating topics here. I think it'll end in like shortly by itself. If not, I will click on leave soon. And once again, thanks, and everybody have a great rest
Thank you
of the
so
day.
much.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.